Chapter 4 Congregated Men 1. Third late fire moon, September, 4:01 a.m. The exhaustion that had built inside Brain hit him all at once, and from the moment he'd entered Gaziv's house, he slept deeply for almost an entire day. When he woke up, he ate a light meal and fell asleep again. He didn't want to admit it, but the reason he could rest so well inside Gaziv's house was that he felt safe. He knew that if Shaltir attacked, that monster would easily defeat even Gaziv. But still, the fact that he was at his one-time rival's house, which seemed like the securest place in the world to him, relaxed Brain in a way that allowed him for this much unguarded rest. Light slanted through the shutters onto Brain's face. The sunlight shone through his eyelids and woke him from a sleep so deep he didn't even dream. After he opened his eyes, he squinted in the bright sun and held up a hand to block a ray. Sitting on the bed, he hurriedly took in his surroundings like a baby mouse. The plain room contained only the bare minimum of furniture. The gear he'd been wearing was piled in one corner.
So, this is the room the captain of the Royal Select offers his guests, huh?
He commented snarkily at the empty room. Relieved no one was around, he stretched. His joints popped audibly, his stiff muscles relaxed, and his circulation improved. He let out a big yawn.
He must have one of his men stay over now and then. This room is probably a letdown.
The reason nobles lived showy lives wasn't only because they were fond of luxury. It was to keep up appearances. Likewise, if a rank-and-file soldier superior lived in a splendidly furnished environment, it would spur him on to apply himself in pursuing promotions.
I guess it's none of my business.
Brain grumbled. Then he snickered. Not at Gaziv, but at himself. If he was capable of considering such trivial things, perhaps he had healed a little from the two great shocks his mind had suffered. He remembered the image of that powerful monster and couldn't keep his hands from shaking.
Yeah.
The fear clinging to his psyche wouldn't come off so easily.
Shaltir Bloodfallen.
An absolute power that even Ainz Ooal Gown, who had sacrificed everything he had to study the blade, couldn't begin to approach. A monster among monsters possessing all the beauty in the world. Or, so it seemed, a possessor of true strength. Just remembering her summoned a fear that permeated his entire body. As a slave to the terror that the monster would come after him, he'd been on the run in the capital with almost no sleep or rest. He'd kept moving, never getting enough rest, ruled by the worries that she would show up while he was sleeping, or slink out of the darkness as he ran down the road at night. The reason he thought to flee to the capital was that if he hid himself in a place with lots of people, he would be harder to find. But he hadn't anticipated that the punishing psychological exhaustion of his severe fugitive lifestyle would find him wishing for death. He hadn't anticipated running into Gaziv either, or had the faint hope that Gaziv could do something, unconsciously pointed his feet in the captain's direction. He didn't know. He had nothing. He opened his hands, and they contained nothing. He glanced at the pile of gear in the corner and saw the katana he'd acquired in order to wrench victory from Gaziv Stronov's grip. But what would be the point in beating him? Now that he knew of a power infinitely greater than them both, what significance did their low-level competitions have?
Plowing fields probably would have been more meaningful.
As he mocked himself, he sensed someone standing outside the door.
Unglaus, seems like you're up.
The voice belonged to the master of the house.
Yeah, Stronov. I'm awake.
The door opened wide, and Gaziv walked in. He was fully outfitted.
You really slept, huh? I'm surprised how well you rested. Yeah, thanks for letting me have a good break. I feel bad. No worries, but I have to head to the castle for now. When I get back, tell me what happened to you. It's an awful story, though. You might end up like me. Still, I can't not hear it. If we talk over drinks, I should be able to handle it. Till then, make yourself at home. If you want food, just let the help know, and they should feed you. And if you're going out into the city, do you have any money? No, but if it comes to it, I'll just sell some of my items.
He held up his ringed hand so Gazov could see it.
Are you sure? Those are pretty valuable, aren't they? Yeah, it's fine.
He had obtained them to defeat Gazov in the first place. What purpose was there in treasuring them now, that he knew that all his efforts were pointless?
Well, sometimes you can't sell expensive items so easily, and it might take time for the buyer to get their money together. Take this.
Gazov took out a small cloth pouch. When he put it in Brain's hand, there was a clinking sound of metal on metal.
Well, thanks. I'll borrow this then.
2. Third late fire moon, September, 10:31 a.m. Sebas walked, wondering what to do about the 5 men who'd been telling him ever since he left the house. He wasn't going anywhere in particular. He'd set out with the belief that getting moving would change his mood and help him find a good idea. After a little while, he saw a crowd of people in the road up ahead. There were voices that could be described as neither shouts nor laughs, and the sound of something being struck. People in the mob were saying things like, "He's going to die," and "Maybe we should call a soldier?" He couldn't see through the throng, but it was clear that some sort of violence was being committed. Sebas thought he would take a different street, went to change directions, hesitated for just a split second, and then proceeded. He was heading for the center of the crowd.
Excuse me.
With those 2 words, he wove his way in, apparently shocked, in awe of this figure slipping by them with unexpected agility for an elderly man. The people he passed by stiffened. There seemed to be others trying to reach the middle of the crowd. He could hear voices saying, "Let me through!" But they struggled, unable to break through the mass of people. Having propelled himself to the center with no trouble, Sebas learned with his own eyes what was going on. There were several poorly dressed men kicking something. Sebas strode silently forward to within arm's length of the group.
"What do you want, old man?"
One of the 5 men realized he was there and loudly challenged him.
I thought you were making a bit of a racket. Are you looking for trouble too?
The men swiftly surrounded Sebas and revealed what they'd been kicking in the process. Was it a boy? He was lying limply on his side and bleeding from either his nose or his mouth. It was unclear which. Perhaps because he'd been getting kicked for so long, he was unconscious, but apparently still alive. Sebas stared down the man. Their bodies and breath reeked of booze, and their faces were red from something other than exercise.
You're drunk, so you can't keep yourselves from turning violent. I don't know what started all this, but how about you leave it at that?
Sebas asked, with a blank expression.
Huh? This kid's food stained my shirt. I'm not about to let him off the hook.
One man pointed to something. Certainly, there was a faint stain on the shirt. However, these men's clothes were all grungy anyway. Considering that, the spot was barely visible. Sebas looked at the one who seemed like the leader of the 5 young men. The butler had the senses of a distinguished warrior, so he could pick up differences humans would overlook.
The city isn't very safe.
One of the men felt ignored at Sebas's distant comment and made a noise like he was offended.
Leave. What'd you say, old man? I'll say it again. Leave. Why you?
The leader got red in the face, balled up his fists, and crumpled to the ground. Many of the surrounding people were shocked, including the other 4 men. What Sebas had done was simple. He'd made a fist, struck the man's jaw with pinpoint precision, at a speed on the very edge of human perception, and rattled his brain with a high-velocity hit. He could throw punches faster than humans could perceive, but if he did that, he wouldn't be able to scare anyone. So, he'd held back.
Do you still want to fight?
Sebas asked quietly. His composure and strength had overcome the intoxication clouding their minds, and they all apologized as they backed away several steps. Sebas felt they were apologizing to the wrong person, but he didn't say anything. He looked away from the fleeing men, carrying their unconscious friend, and went to take a step toward the boy, but his foot stopped midway.
What am I doing?
What he needed to do was think of a way to solve his problem. Only an idiot would make more trouble for himself at a time like this. Wasn't the whole reason he was in his current predicament because he acted so compassionately without thinking?
I saved him for now. I should be satisfied with that.
With those thoughts in his mind, Sebas approached the figure on the ground. He touched the limp, immobile boy's back and poured chi into him. A full-powered infusion would have easily healed him completely, but that would definitely have drawn too much attention. He stopped at the minimum and pointed at someone when their eyes happened to meet.
Take this child to the shrine. His breastbone may be broken, so take care when you carry him. Put him on a board, and try not to bump him around too much.
When the man nodded at the orders, Sebas set off walking. There was no need to elbow his way through the crowd. The wall of people neatly parted for him. Right after he left, he sensed that the number of people telling him had gone up. There was just one problem: their identity. The 5 men who had been following him from the mansion had to be Sakurante's henchmen. So who were the 2 who joined after the incident with the boy? The sound of the footsteps and stride length indicated adult males, but Sebas had no idea who they might be.
Well, thinking about it won't get me an answer. I guess I'll catch them.
Sebas continued walking, turning down dirtier and dirtier streets. He was still being followed.
Are they even trying to hide themselves?
There was no indication they were attempting to conceal their footsteps.
Is it because they don't have that ability, or is there some other reason?
Sebas cocked his head and decided he should simply find out. Once the presence of other people had dwindled, right when Sebas was about to make his move, the hoarse, but still young-sounding, male voice of one of his pursuers called out to him. "Excuse me!" 3. Third late fire moon, September, 10:27 a.m. Clyde was thinking as he walked back to the castle. He replayed that morning session with Gazif in his mind several times, ruminating on what he could have done to put up a better fight. Around the time he decided on some tactics to try if there was a next time, he discovered a crowd of people making some angry shouts. 2 soldiers were watching awkwardly from nearby. From the middle of the crowd, he could hear a ruckus, and it belonged to no normal voices. Clyde took a firm expression and strode toward the soldiers. "What are you doing?" The sudden call from behind startled the soldiers, and they turned to look at Clyde. They were equipped with mail and spears. Over the mail shirts, they wore something like a surcoat with the kingdom's coat of arms. It was the typical appearance of a kingdom guard, but these 2 didn't seem highly trained. First of all, their physiques were not particularly built. Plus, their beards weren't neatly shaved, and their mail shirts weren't polished, which made them look rather unclean. Overall, they seemed sloppy.
"And you are?"
One of the guards asked in a voice that implied confusion and anger at the sudden call from someone younger than him. "I'm off duty," Clyde declared, and the man's consternation showed on his face. Probably because an obviously younger boy seemed to be suggesting his rank was higher. For the time being, the soldier appeared to judge that taking a humble approach would be smart, and straightened up.
"There seems to be some sort of disturbance."
Clyde repressed the urge to reprimand them with an, "I got that much." Unlike the soldiers guarding the castle, the ones patrolling the city were commoners, so they hadn't been through as much training. They were essentially peasants who'd learned to use a weapon. Clyde moved his eyes from the nervous soldiers to the cluster of people. Rather than expecting these 2 to do something, it would be faster to act himself. Maybe he was exceeding the authority of his position by sticking his nose in their business, but he wouldn't have been able to explain to his compassionate master if he stood by while people suffered. "You guys wait here." Having made up his mind, Climb forced his way into the mass of people without listening for a reply. Even if there was a small gap, he couldn't slip through. No, it would be strange if there were a human who could. As he desperately elbowed his way through, nearly getting shoved aside, he heard a voice from the center of the crowd.
"Leave." "Ah, what'd you say, old man?" "I'll say it again. Leave." "Why you?"
This is bad. They were going to lash out again, this time at an old man. When Climb popped out of the crowd, flushed after frantically pushing his way through, the first thing he saw was an elderly man and the men surrounding him. There was a child who looked like a tattered rag at their feet. The elegance of the well-dressed older man indicated he either was a noble or served one. The robust men around him seemed drunk. A glance was all it would take to tell who was in the wrong. The man who seemed to be the strongest curled his hands into tight fists. The difference between that man and the old one was overwhelming. He had a stocky body, bulky muscles, and a violent temperament that wouldn't hesitate to shed blood. If he hit the older man, he could easily send him flying. The people around them who realized this released faint screams at the thought of the tragedy about to befall the old man. Climb was the only one among them who sensed something was off. Certainly, the other man looked more robust, but Climb had the feeling that the absolute power he sensed belonged to the older one. That momentary distraction meant he lost his chance to stop the violence. The man balled up his fists and collapsed. Surprised voices sounded all around Climb. The old man had made a fist and whacked the drunk's jaw with terrifying accuracy, at quite a high speed. It was a punch that even Climb, who had trained his eyes to follow fast movements, could only just make out.
"Do you still want to fight?"
The old man's deep, quiet voice asked the question. His composure and sudden display of strength was incredibly sobering for the drunk men. No, even the spectators were overcome by the elderly man's drive. The men had completely lost their will to fight.
We're sorry."
They all apologized as they backed away several steps. Then they picked up their friend from his awkward position on the ground and fled. Climb didn't feel like pursuing them. Mesmerized by the old man's straight posture, he couldn't move. His spine was straight as a sword. Any soldier aspired to cut a figure like that. After touching the boy's back, perhaps palpating to examine him, the old man asked a bystander to take care of him and walked off. The crowd parted in a straight line, creating a path, and no one took their eyes off his back. That was the effect of such poise. Climb rushed over to the boy on the ground and took out the potion Gazav had given him during their training session. "Can you drink this?" There was no response. The boy had lost consciousness completely. Climb opened the bottle and sprinkled the potion over his body. Many people thought potions were only for drinking, but they worked equally well when they were poured on the target. Such was the extraordinary nature of magic. As if the boy's skin was drinking it in, the liquid was absorbed into his body. The color returned to his face. Relieved, Climb nodded once. The bystanders were just as surprised at the use of such an expensive item as they were at the old man's moves. Climb had given up a potion, but naturally, he didn't regret it. As long as taxes were being collected from the people, it was his duty as someone subsisting on that money to protect them and keep the peace. If he couldn't do that, he should at least do this. "Since I used a potion on him, he should be fine. But we should still probably take him to the shrine, just in case." When he glanced at the guards standing by, there were 3 more. They must have shown up late. The guards who had finally arrived on the scene turned a critical eye on all the people in the area. Climb spoke to one of the uncomfortable-looking patrolmen. "Take this child to the shrine."
"What in the world?"
"He was beaten up. I used a healing potion on him, so I think he's okay. But I want you to take him to the shrine just to be sure.
Right. Understood.
Climb decided he would leave the rest up to the guards. His work there was done. A soldier from the castle probably shouldn't stick his nose into other jurisdictions too much. Can I ask you to get the details about what happened from someone who saw the whole thing?
Understood.
Then, I'll leave the rest up to you. The guards were more confident with orders, and after Climb confirmed that they were taking efficient action, he stood up and took off running. He heard one of them call.
Where are you going?
But he ignored it. When he got to the street where the old man had turned, he slowed down. He caught sight of his target right away. Really, he wanted to call out to him immediately, but he wasn't feeling quite brave enough. He felt an overwhelming amount of pressure, like a thick, invisible wall. The old man continued walking, turning down dirtier and dirtier streets. Climb continued after him. All the time he was following, he couldn't bring himself to talk to him. I'm killing him. Climb despaired at his own conduct. He shouldn't do that no matter how hard it was to talk to someone. I need to change the situation. He fretted as he kept walking. Eventually, about when they'd reached a back alley devoid of human presence, Climb took a few deep breaths and shouted with all the courage he could muster, like a man confessing his feelings to a girl he liked. Excuse me! The old man whirled around in response to the voice. His hair was completely white, as was his beard, but his back was straight as the blade of a steel sword. Conspicuous wrinkles in his chiseled features gave him an air of kindness, but his penetrating eyes were like those of a hawk targeting its prey. He even had the elegance of a great noble.
Did you need something?
The old man's voice was a bit hoarse, but full of a lively, dignified energy. Climb felt an invisible force pressing in on him, and he swallowed. Overwhelmed by the power of the old man, he couldn't get proper words out. Noticing that, the old man relaxed.
Who are you?
His tone was gentle. Finally, released from that heavy pressure, Climb's throat could work normally. My name is Climb, and I'm a soldier here. Thank you for doing what should have been my job. Climb bowed, humble and low. The old man squinted slightly, thinking, and then seemed to realize what Climb meant with a little.
Oh, it was no trouble. I'll be going now.
Climb raised his head and, as the old man clipped the conversation short and started walking off, said, Please wait! Actually, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I've been following you because, and I hope you'll laugh at my impertinence, if you don't mind. I'd like you to mentor me about that skill you used.
What do you mean by that?
I'm working very hard to get stronger. So when I saw your incredible movements earlier, I thought it would be great if I could get you to teach me the skill. The old man looked Climb up and down.
Let me see your hands.
Climb stuck out his hands, and the old man gazed intently at his palms. He couldn't help but feel uneasy. The old man flipped his hands over, glanced at his nails, and then nodded in satisfaction.
They're thick and sturdy. Good warrior hands.
The smile on the compliment made Climb feel warm inside. The rush of happiness was on par with the one he felt when Gazav had praised him. No, I'm barely a soldier.
No need for modesty. Next, may I see your sword?
The old man gazed first at the grip, then at the blade of the sword he was handed.
I see. Is this a spare weapon?
How did you know?
So it is, then. There's a dent here.
When he closely examined the place the old man was pointing at, sure enough, the blade had a slight ding in it. It must have struck something in an awkward way during training. How embarrassing! Climb was so mortified, he wished he could disappear. Because Climb was aware of how unskilled he was, he paid an obsessive amount of attention to his weapons to gain even a little bit of an edge. Or at least, up until that moment, he thought so.
I see. I have a rough understanding of your personality now. Hands and weapons are mirrors of a warrior's character. You've made a very favorable impression on me.
Climb, beat red to his ears, looked admiringly at the old man. What he saw was a gracious, good-natured smile.
Okay, I'll train you, but just a bit. However...
He stopped Climb before he could thank him.
There is something I want to ask. You said you're a soldier, right? Well, the other day I saved this woman.
After hearing the old man Sebas's story, Climb was furious. He couldn't hide his disgust at the fact that someone would abuse the emancipation of the slaves Rainier had proclaimed, and that nothing had even changed yet. No, that wasn't right. Climb shook his head. The law prohibited the buying and selling of slaves. However, it wasn't uncommon to have people working off debts in poor conditions. That loophole had become a free-for-all. Actually, it was probably precisely because there was a loophole that the law managed to get enacted at all. Rainier's law is nearly meaningless. The thought flitted across Climb's mind, but he shook it off. What he needed to consider right now was Sebas's circumstances. He furrowed his brow. Sebas was at a total disadvantage. Certainly, it would be possible to investigate the terms of the young woman's contract and counterattack, but he couldn't imagine the opposing side wasn't prepared for such a tactic. If they appealed to the law, Sebas would surely lose. The fact that the other men hadn't already done so had to be because they felt they could rip him off even better some other way.
Do you happen to know anyone who isn't corrupt, who could help me?
Climb knew only one person. He could say with confidence that there was no noble with more integrity than Rainier. He knew she could be trusted. But he couldn't introduce her. If these people were capable of skirting the slave trafficking prohibition, they were sure to have connections within various power structures. Naturally, the nobles they were affiliated with probably had a fair bit of authority. If the princess, a member of the king's faction, invoked state authority to investigate, enact a rescue, and cause losses for the nobles' faction, it could lead to an all-out war. Exercising authority wasn't such a simple matter. One wrong move could trigger a civil war, especially in a case like their divided kingdoms. He couldn't let Rainier be responsible for the downfall of the state. Lacus felt the same way, which was why their earlier conversation had gone as it had. That was why Climb hadn't said anything. No, couldn't say anything. However, Sebas had interpreted his anguished silence. He murmured,
I see.
And then offered additional news that shocked Climb.
From what she told me, there are still others held captive in the building, men and women alike.
What the heck? So does that mean there's another brothel besides the one run by the slave trafficking org? Or is it the same one? If it's a matter of allowing them to flee somewhere, I would have to ask my master. But she has some land, so maybe they could go there.
Would that be possible? Would you be able to shelter the woman I saved as well?
My apologies, Sir Sebas, but I can't promise anything without asking my master. That said, she is a very compassionate person. I think it'll be all right.
If you have that much faith in your master, she must be a wonderful person.
Climb nodded emphatically. He had a more admirable master than anyone.
I'm changing subjects here, but if you could prove slave trafficking activities were taking place at the brothel, what would happen to it? Would even that get covered up?
There's a possibility they would be forced to close up shop if we turned in the evidence to the proper authorities. At least, I want to believe the kingdom isn't that corrupt.
Understood. Now then, allow me to ask you a different question. Why do you want to get stronger?
Huh? Climb let out a foolish-sounding yelp, caught off guard by the sudden topic change.
You just said you want me to train you. I've judged that I can trust you. But I want to know the reason you are pursuing power.
Climb squinted as he pondered. Why do I want to get stronger? Climb had been abandoned as a child and didn't know either of his parents' faces. In the kingdom, this wasn't such a rare thing, and it wasn't uncommon to die face down in the mud either. It had been Climb's fate to die in such a way in the rain that day. But instead, he had met the sun. After crawling around in the dirt in the dim his entire existence, he was enthralled by its brilliance. When he was young, he had admired her, and as he grew, the feeling assumed a stronger form: love. He had to destroy that emotion. A miracle like in the sagas the bard sang would never happen in the real world. Just as no human could reach the sun, Climb's feelings would never reach her. No, he couldn't allow them to. The woman Climb loved was fated to be another man's wife. There was no way a princess would end up bound to someone like Climb, whose status was lower than a peasant's and whose origins were unknown. If the king suddenly collapsed and the eldest prince assumed the throne, Rainier would surely be married off immediately to one of the great nobles. It had probably already been decided between the prince and the noble. Or, it was possible, there would be a strategic marriage to someone in a neighboring country. It was strange that she was of age, but had no husband or even a fiancé. It was a golden moment, and he would have given anything to stop time. If he didn't have to train so much, he would have been able to relish it a little more. Climb was an ordinary person with no innate ability. Still, thanks to his hard work, he'd managed to get fairly strong as a soldier. So deciding he was satisfied with that, quitting his workouts and spending a little more time next to Rainier would be a better use of his time. Wouldn't it? But, could he really do that? Climb admired her brilliance. That was no lie, nor was it mistaken. It was just a feeling from his heart. But, I'm a man, so... Climb laughed. Yes, he wanted to stand next to her. The sun shone up in the sky, a human who could never stand next to it. Still, he wanted to climb as high as he could, be someone who could stand even a little closer to her. He didn't want to be forever looking up at her in admiration. These were the silly feelings of a boy, but they were good for a boy to have. He wanted to be a man suitable for the woman he admired, even if they would never be together. It was because he had those feelings that he could endure his friendless life, his difficult warrior path, and the studies that chipped away at his sleeping time. If anyone wants to laugh at my foolish ideas, let them. Only a person who had truly loved someone could understand. Seba squinted as he intently observed the boy, wanting to comprehend the countless meanings contained in the short reply. Then he nodded in satisfaction.
Based on your reply, I've decided what sort of training to give you.
Climb was about to thank him, but a hand moved out to stop him.
But, I'm sorry to say, it appears you have no innate aptitude. If I were to really commit to training you, it would take a long time, and I don't have that luxury. I'd like to train you in a way that is effective and possible in a short amount of time. But, it's quite intense.
Climb gulped. Sebas's eyes sent a chill up his spine. They were the piercing eyes of someone whose power surpassed Gaziv's best efforts. As impossible as that seemed, that was why he couldn't answer immediately.
I'll be blunt. You could die.
He's not kidding. Climb sensed that. He didn't mind dying if it was for Rainier's sake. But he definitely didn't want to die for his own selfish reasons. He wasn't a coward. No, maybe he was. He swallowed and wavered. For a little while, it was so quiet, they could hear a far-off commotion.
Whether you die or not depends on your spirit. If you have something precious to you, if you have reason to cling to life, even if you're brought to your knees, you should be all right.
Wasn't he going to teach me martial arts? Climb began to wonder in the back of his mind, but that wasn't the issue at this point. He considered the meaning of Sebas's words, digested it, and then replied, "I'm ready. Please train me."
You mean you're confident you won't die?
Climb shook his head. That wasn't it. He wanted to cling to life even if it was on his knees, because he always had a reason to. Having perhaps read these feelings in Climb's eyes, Sebas nodded emphatically.
Understood. Then, let's begin the training.
Here?
Yes. It will only take a few minutes. Prepare your weapon.
What in the world are we going to do? Climb drew his sword and faced the unknown with a mixture of apprehension and confusion, as well as a tiny bit of anticipation and curiosity. The ring of the blade sliding against its sheath echoed in the narrow alley. Climb pointed the sword at Sebas's eyes, and Sebas stared at him.
Okay, here I go. Do your best to stay conscious.
And the next moment, it was almost like blades of ice had shot out from him in every direction. Climb had no words. What was really swirling around Sebas was a killing intent. A thick, dark presence surged over Climb like a wave, almost enough to crush his heart at that moment. He thought he heard a scream like someone's soul being broken. It could have come from close by or far away, or it could have spurted out of his own mouth. Tossed on the murderous black torrent, Climb felt his consciousness beginning to wide out. There was so much fear that his mind was trying to let go of consciousness to avoid it.
Is this how much of a man you are? I'm just getting warmed up.
Sebas's disappointment echoed loudly within Climb's fading awareness. Those words cut Climb deeper than any blade could. It was enough to make him forget the terror coming at him, even if only for a moment. Ba-bum! His heart thumped once loudly. He exhaled sharply. He was so scared, wanted to run away, but he desperately stood his ground with tears in his eyes. His hand shook and the tip of his sword wobbled crazily. His mail shirt was making a racket. He was shaking so hard. Still, he desperately clenched his jaw to stop his teeth from chattering and tried to withstand his terror of Sebas. Sebas snorted at Climb's unseemly state and slowly began to ball up his raised right hand. In less than a few blinks, it had become a round fist. Then, one of them slowly began moving back, as if it were being drawn like a bowstring. Realizing what was about to happen, Climb shook his head, trembling. Sebas, of course, would not entertain his wish.
Well then, please die.
Like an arrow released from a fully drawn bow, Sebas's fist zoomed forward with a roar of ripping air. This is instant death. Climb sensed it in slow motion. His mind was seized by the perfect image of death. An iron ball much taller than he was, zooming straight for him at a furious speed. If he shielded himself with his sword, his fist would smash through like it was nothing. His entire body could no longer move. He was so tense he'd frozen. There's no way to escape the death I'm facing. Climb gave up, but then got irritated at himself. If he was going to die for Renair's sake, then why didn't he just give up back then? He should have died shivering all alone in the rain. He saw Renair's beautiful face. They say a person's life flashes before their eyes when they're on the brink of death. Supposedly, that's the brain groping through the memories of the person's entire past for a possible way to escape. So Climb found it strange that the last thing he would see was the smile of the master he loved and respected. Yes, she was smiling. She hadn't smiled for him when she was young, right after she saved him. When did she start smiling for me? He couldn't remember, but he did remember her timidly doing so. Would that smile become a frown when she heard he died? Would thick clouds blot out the sun? Damn it! Climb's heart flooded with rage. His life had been tossed into the street, and she had picked it up. That meant this life was not his. He existed for Renair, to make her even a little bit happier. There has to be a way to escape! The fierce emotion shattered the chains of fear. His hands moved. His feet moved. The eyes he'd been trying to squeeze shut flew open and frantically shifted to the fists rushing at him with incredible speed. It was like all his body senses had been sharpened to extremes, as if he could detect the slightest vibration in the air. It's said there exists a phenomenon known as hysterical strength. It's the unbelievable potential people are able to exhibit in extreme situations because their brain releases the limiter holding back their physical power. The brain secretes large volumes of hormones, concentrating the mental faculties all for the purpose of survival. Suddenly, the person can process a vast amount of information at high speed in order to discern the appropriate course of action. Climb entered the realm of the best warriors for a brief moment. But Sebas's attack was still faster. Surely, it was already too late. He probably wouldn't have time to dodge the fist. Still, he had to move. There was no way he could give up. He could tell he was moving like a tortoise in this intensely compressed period of time, but he desperately twisted his body. Then, Sebas's fist blew by Climb's face. The ensuing wind pulled out a few of his hairs. A quiet voice reached his ears.
Congratulations. How does it feel to have conquered the fear of death?
Climb stood there with a dazed expression, not understanding what he'd just been asked.
How was it? How did it feel to face death? How does it feel to have overcome it?
Breathing hard, Climb stared at Sebas with an empty expression, as if he'd lost something. It was like his intent to kill had been nothing more than a lie. Sebas's words sank into his brain, and he finally felt relief flooding him. As if the violent drive to kill had been propping him up, Climb crumbled to the ground like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Flat on the road, he voraciously sucked fresh air into his lungs.
You're lucky you didn't die of shock. It happens sometimes. People become convinced they will actually die and give up on life.
Climb still tasted something bitter in the back of his throat. He was sure it was the taste of death.
If we repeat this a few times, you should end up able to overcome ordinary fear. We need to be careful, though, because this stimulates your survival instincts. If you grow numb to it, you won't be able to recognize clear danger. You always need situational awareness.
Forgive me, but who or what are you? Climb gasped from below.
What do you mean?
That killing resolve was not the sort a normal person can project. So what in the world?
For now, let's say I'm just an old man who has confidence in his strength.
Climb couldn't take his eyes off Sebas's smiling face. The expression seemed to be born of kindness, but it also seemed like the fierce grin of one with absolute power, far surpassing even Gazov. A man who might far exceed Gazov, the strongest warrior from any of the nearby nations. Climb decided his curiosity would be satisfied with that. He didn't think it would be right to press the issue. Still, the question of who this old man Sebas was lingered stubbornly in his mind. He even wondered if he might be one of the 13 heroes.
Then, I think it's about time to get going.
Wait! There's something I want to ask you!
A terrified voice echoed out from behind them, interrupting Sebas. 4. Third late fire moon. September. 9:42 a.m. Brain left Gazov's house. He turned around and, thinking ahead to his return, took mental note of what the building looked like. When Gazov had brought him here, he'd been only half-conscious due to his low body temperature, so he didn't really remember it. The location of Gazov's house he knew, because he'd been gathering information on him in order to challenge him to a duel in the future. But that was just second-hand information, and there were slight discrepancies with the truth.
There's no sword stuck in the roof.
Cursing the information dealer who told him such half-baked rumors, he took a close look at the house. It was far smaller than the mansions nobles lived in, and seemed more like a place for regular citizens with a little extra money. Still, it was more than big enough for Gaziv and the elderly couple who served him. Having memorized the image, Brain set off. He wasn't going anywhere in particular. Before, he might have wanted to go hunting for weapons, armor, or magic items, but not anymore.
I wonder what I should do.
His grumbles disappeared into the air. He thought he wouldn't mind just vanishing somewhere. He was still actually attracted to the idea of dying. When he searched his heart for what he desired, all he found was a gaping hole. His goal had been completely destroyed. Not even a husk of it remained.
So why?
Glancing down at his right hand, he saw his katana. Under his shirt, there was mail. He'd been holding his katana so tightly on his way to the capital out of fear. Even though he knew it would have no effect on the monster Shaltir, who repelled his full-strength attacks with the fingernail, he was anxious without it.
So why am I holding it now? I should have been able to leave it behind. Am I still anxious?
Brain thought, but then shook his head.
No.
But in the end, he couldn't figure out what motivation caused him to bring the sword. Brain walked along, remembering the way the royal capital was the first time he visited it. Some buildings, like the Wizards Guild and the castle, hadn't changed, but he also saw lots of new edifices. As he enjoyed the stroll down memory lane, he came upon a disturbance happening down the road. He frowned at the commotion. He could sense the bristling sensation of violence from the center of the crowd.
Guess I'll go somewhere else,
He thought, but just as he turned his feet in a different direction, an old man caught his eye. He was approaching the center of the crowd with such fluid motions, he seemed to be gliding.
Huh? What the heck? How does he do that?
The words slipped out of Brain's mouth in spite of himself, as he blinked several times. The way the old man moved was just too unbelievable. Brain thought he must have just seen a waking dream, or the workings of some kind of magic spell. Brain probably couldn't do that himself. It was a skill that required a complete grasp of another's consciousness, as well as the overall waves of the pushing and shoving crowd. It was the pinnacle of movement itself. With zero hesitation, Brain's legs carried him toward the crowd of people. After pushing and shoving his way through to the center, Brain emerged just in time to see the old man swiftly whack the other man's jaw.
What the heck? Would I even be able to block that? Seems tricky. Was he manipulating the guy's attention and gaze? Maybe I'm thinking too hard. Still, that punch was clean enough to be included in a training manual.
As Brain ruminated on the attack he'd just witnessed, an impressed grunt escaped his lips. It wasn't as if he'd seen it clearly, and it was extremely difficult to evaluate fistfighters and swordsmen on the same scale. Still, from just that short amount of time, he'd understood that the man was terribly strong.
It's possible he's stronger than me.
Biting his lower lip, he compared the old man's profile to all the strong people he could remember. But there wasn't a match.
Who in the world is this guy?
A moment later, the old man had left the circle of onlookers. A boy walked off after him. As if tempted by the boy's actions, Brain followed behind him. The old man seemed to have eyes in the back of his head, so Brain couldn't bring himself to trail directly behind him, but he didn't have that worry with the boy. He also shrewdly considered that even if the boy were found out, he would be safe. As soon as he started after them, he realized there were multiple people shadowing either the old man or the boy, but Brain didn't care. Eventually, the two of them turned down dimmer and dirtier streets. Brain became concerned. It was almost like the old man was leading them somewhere. Just as he started to question if the boy didn't wonder where they were going, he called out to the old man. Fortunately for Brain, they began having a conversation immediately around a corner, so he hid himself behind it and listened. To sum up their conversation, the boy wanted lessons from the old man.
There's no way. An old guy that strong would never take this little turd as a disciple.
Comparing their ability levels, Brain figured that if the boy was a pebble, the old man was a huge gem. Their worlds were too far apart.
How sad. How incredibly sad that he can't even see the gap in their abilities. Leave it at that, kid.
Brain whispered silently in his head. It was meant for the boy, but at the same time he was mocking his foolish old self, who had been convinced he was the strongest. As he listened, he couldn't have cared less about the brothel. The old man appeared to offer the boy some training this one time. He had no idea what the old man saw in him.
What could it mean? Or am I missing something? Nah, that can't be it. That brat has barely any ability as a warrior, and next to no potential.
What kind of training would it be? He could hear from his current position, but he couldn't see. Letting his curiosity get the better of him, he moved, concealing its presence, to peek around the corner. That was when a horrifying presence pierced his entire body. He let out a wordless shriek. His entire body froze. It was like the breath of a gigantic carnivorous beast. The world was so coated in an overwhelming sense of impending death that he couldn't blink, much less move. He felt like even his heart had stopped. This presence could have rivaled that of the one Brain believed to be the most powerful in the whole world, Shaltir Bloodfallens. Far from seeming to stop, a weaker man's heart would have probably actually failed. His legs shook so hard, he fell back onto his butt.
If this is what it's like for me, that kid's probably dead. Passed out if he's lucky.
Scared though he was, Brain crawled into a position from which he could see the two figures. And what he saw was so unbelievable, he completely forgot his fear for a split second. The boy was still standing. The same fear assailing Brain made the younger man's legs tremble. But he was still standing.
What the heck? How can that kid still be on his feet?
Brain couldn't understand how the boy could stand if his own legs had humiliatingly given out under the fear.
Does he have a magic item or martial art that protects him from fear? Or is he a talent holder?
Those things weren't completely out of the question, but seeing how helpless he looked, Brain sensed it was something else. It was an impossible conclusion, but it was the only one he could come up with. The boy was stronger than him.
No way. There's just no way that can be true.
He was probably working out, but he wasn't anywhere near big enough. Judging from his footwork and his technique as he told the old man, Brain didn't think he could have a terrible amount of ability. The boy didn't seem to be made of much, but this outcome said otherwise.
What is going on? Am I really that weak?
His vision began to blur. He realized he was crying, but he didn't have the energy to wipe away the tears. He frantically stifled his sobs, but the tears fell one after the other.
Why? Why?
He clenched the dirt beneath him and stood up. Still, he was immobile under the desire to kill pummeling him. It was like his feet were under someone else's control. They were paralyzed. It was all he could do to look up and observe the old man and the boy. He could see the boy's back. The boy was still standing. He was still facing the old man, projecting all that bloodthirst. He thought the boy was weak, but now he seemed so beyond him.
Am I really this weak?
He was irritated at himself. Even when the killing urge vanished, he could barely stand. It seemed like the boy and the old man were going to continue their training, but, unable to hold himself back any longer, Brain mustered his courage and jumped out from behind the corner.
Wait!
In his current state, Brain didn't have the wherewithal to consider that he shouldn't interrupt them or that he should wait for a better moment. The boy whipped around with a jerk of his shoulders, startled at the panicked voice. If Brain had been in his position, he probably would have reacted the same way.
First, please accept my heartfelt apology for interrupting you. I couldn't wait.
Do you know him, Sir Sebas?
No, I do not. So you don't know him either?
They regarded him suspiciously, but he had expected that.
My name is Ainz Ooal. Please allow me to apologize again for interrupting you. My deepest apologies.
He bowed even lower than the first time, and sensed the pair shift slightly, when enough time had passed to properly express his regret. Brain lifted his head. He could tell they were a little less wary of him now.
And what is it you want?
At the old man's question, Brain flicked his eyes to the boy. What could you possibly want with me? It was difficult for Brain, but he asked the puzzled boy.
Why, how were you able to stand in the face of such murderous pressure?
The boy's eyes widened slightly. Because he was holding a neutral expression, even that small of a change implied a large emotional shock.
I want to know. That was beyond the realm of what a normal person can handle. Damn it. Excuse my language. It was beyond what even I could take. But you're different. You did it. You stood. How did you do it? Up against something so powerful.
He was so agitated, it slipped into his speech, but he couldn't hold himself back. He'd fled from the overwhelming power of Shaltir Bloodfallen. This boy had stood there when faced with an equal thirst for blood.
Where does the gap come from?
He just had to know. Perhaps his intention had gotten through. The boy seemed flustered, but still gave the question careful consideration before replying. I don't know. I have no idea why I was able to stand my ground in such a murderous storm. But it might have been because I was thinking about my master.
Your master?
Yes, I was thinking about the person I serve, and I managed to hang on. Brain wanted to shout.
There's no way that's all you did.
But the old man began to speak.
So your loyalty is so great it overcomes fear. Sir Ooal, people can display unbelievable power if it's for someone they hold dear. Like how a mother can lift the beam of a collapsed house to save a child, or how a man can hold his wife by one hand if she's about to fall. That is, I believe, human strength. This boy was able to tap into that power, and he's not the only one who can do it. If you have something you could never give up, you can probably display power beyond what you think you have as well.
Brain couldn't believe it. His thirst for power that he'd thought he could never give up had turned out to be meaningless, hadn't it? He'd easily broken, become frightened, and run away. His expression had been clouding over, but he snapped back to attention as Sebas continued.
When you cultivate something on your own, it's weak, because if you bend, that's the end. If instead you build something with another person or for someone, you may bend, but you won't break.
Brain wondered.
Do I have anyone like that?
But he didn't. He decided they weren't useful to him and thrown away those relationships. So the things he'd abandoned in his craving for power were actually the most important. Brain laughed. His whole life was mistake after mistake, and so he ended up grumbling.
I threw them all away. Do you think there's anything I can do about it now?
You'll be all right. I don't have any innate ability, and I was able to do it. I'm sure you can do it, Sir Ooal. It's never too late. They were the baseless words of a boy. Still, Brain felt some warmth in his heart.
You're kind. And strong. I'm sorry.
The boy answered the sudden apology with a blank expression. He was so strong, but Brain had been looking down on him as just a turd.
I'm a fool. I'm such a fool.
By the way, you wouldn't happen to be the Ainz Ooal Gown who once fought Sir Stronov, would you?
You know your stuff, huh? Were you watching the fight?
Oh no, I didn't see it. I just heard the story from someone who did. They said you were a fantastic swordsman, certainly one of the best in the kingdom. The way you carry yourself, your balanced movements, make me think it's the truth. With the pure goodwill weighing heavily on him, Brain stammered out a reply.
Thank you. I don't think of myself like that at all. But to hear you praise me makes me kind of happy. Sir Unglaus,
began the old man.
Sir, just Unglaus is fine. I'm not worthy of being treated with such respect by someone with such strength. Very well. My name is Sebastian, so please call me Sebas. Now then, would you mind instructing Climb here in swordsmanship? I think it would benefit you as well.
Oh, please excuse me. My name is Climb, Sir Unglaus.
Sir, excuse me, Sebas. Won't you be training him? It seemed like you were going to before I interrupted. Yes, I had intended to, but we have company, so I think I will deal with them. Oh, here they are. It must have taken some time to arm themselves.
A moment later, Brain turned in the direction Sebas was looking. 3 men slowly showed themselves. They wore shirts of mail, and in their hands, protected by thick leather gloves, were their naked blades. Their mood had already gone beyond hostile, and was simply murderous. It was directed at the old man, but it didn't seem like they had a fraction of the mercy necessary to leave any witnesses alive. Brain was shocked, and shouted hoarsely in spite of himself.
Of all the ridiculous! They felt that bloodlust and still want to come over here? Are they that strong?
If that were the case, they each had to be equal to, no, stronger than, Brain. Maybe the reason they were so bad at stealth was because they specialized so intensely in warrior abilities. But Sebas dismissed all of Brain's worries.
I only directed that at you two.
Huh?
Brain knew he sounded like an idiot.
For Climb, it was training. For you, it was to smoke you out. Or I suppose to discourage you from fighting or taking a hostile stance, since I didn't know who you were and you refused to show yourself. I knew these men were enemies from the beginning, though, so I didn't direct any at them. It would have been problematic if they had gotten scared and run away.
Listening to Sebas's horrifying explanation, Brain gave up on being surprised. The ability to control that much power to exclude targets transcended common sense.
I see. Then you know who they are. I have a guess, but there's no conclusive evidence. So I'm thinking to capture 1 or 2 and get some intelligence out of them. However,
Sebas lowered his head.
I do not wish to involve you in these matters. Could I ask you to please get away from here immediately?
Before that, I'd like to ask you something. Are they criminals?
Climb asked.
They sure seem like it. The type with something to hide.
Brain's comment saw flames leap into Climb's eyes.
I don't mean to intrude, but I would also like to fight. As a keeper of the peace in the capital, it's only natural for me to protect the people.
It's not like we know that Sebas is representing justice,
thought Brain. Sure, compared to the guys who had just shown up, anyone would think Sebas and his mien that practically screamed integrity were in the right. But there was no guarantee.
This kid's so green.
But he knew how the boy felt. Comparing a man who would protect a child from a bunch of drunks to these guys, Brain knew which side he would choose.
Not that I think you need reinforcements, Sebas, but I'll be damned if... I'll help out as well.
Brain stood next to Climb. Sebas didn't need assistance. Really, there was no point for them to even be there. But Brain figured he would follow Climb's example and try fighting for someone else, choosing the option he wouldn't have taken before. He would protect the boy whose heart was strong, but whose skill with a sword wasn't enough to match it. Brain peered at the weapons the men were holding and furrowed his brow.
They're poisoned. If they're using something they could end up hurting themselves with, they must have some experience. Could they be assassins?
The grooved daggers, called Mailbreakers, glistened with some kind of slimy, abnormal liquid in the depression. What affirmed Brain's murmured hypothesis were their nimble movements, which prioritized mobility more than a swordsman's would.
Climb, be careful. Unless you have a magic item that will protect you from poison, consider even a single hit bad news.
When one's physical ability was at Brain's level, it was normal to have built up a resistance to the most common poisons. But Climb probably wouldn't be able to withstand anything very potent.
The reason they're facing us head-on but not immediately attacking is because they're waiting for the other two to flank us, correct? If we have the chance, why don't we just break straight through?
Sebas had purposely spoken just loud enough for their opponents to overhear, and they froze for a moment. They were startled that he'd seen through their plan to surround them.
That seems like the safest move. It's probably even safer to crush the vanguard first, and then take on the ones behind.
Brain affirmed Sebas's idea, but then Sebas himself shot it down.
Oh, but they'd run away if we did that. I'll take the three in front, so could you take on the two coming around?
Brain confirmed, and Climb nodded yes. This was Sebas's battle. They were just forcing him to allow them to help. Unless Sebas was about to make a fatal error, their role was to act in accordance with his plan.
Okay, let's go.
Brain told Climb, turning away from the men. He was able to show his open back to the hostile enemies because Sebas was there. Letting Sebas cover him gave him a peace of mind, like the protection of a thick castle wall.
Now then, unfortunately for you gentlemen, I'll be your opponent. Oh, but please don't get distracted by these two.
Brain looked over his shoulder and saw 3 daggers between the ringed fingers of Sebas's right hand. When he spread his fingers, the daggers the men had thrown at the defenseless Brain and Climb fell to the ground. The men's will to fight shrank visibly.
No kidding. Anyone would lose the motivation to fight after watching their daggers get caught. Did you finally figure out how strong Sebas is? But it's too late now.
They wouldn't be able to escape this old man, even if they scattered.
Amazing.
Climb moved in line with Brain.
Yeah, if someone said Sebas was the strongest in the kingdom, I would agree.
Even stronger than the captain of the Royal Select?
Stronov. Yeah. To be frank, if Gazif and I took Sebas on 2-1, we'd still have no chance. Oh, here they come.
2 men appeared and circled around the outside. As could be expected, they looked much more like the other 3. At the sound of a sword being drawn next to him, Brain followed suit.
The reason one of them isn't hiding in the shadows throwing daggers must be because Sebas was onto them.
An ambush was effective because it was hidden. If it was revealed, all it did was diffuse their muscle. They must have figured that since they'd already been discovered, they had a better chance of victory if they each took 1 man.
They have no idea. Climb! I'll take the one on the right. You take the left.
He instructed the boy after judging which of their opponents was weaker from his movements. Climb nodded and assumed a stance. His unhesitating manner was that of someone who had been in a life-threatening skirmish before. Brain was relieved he wasn't a battle virgin who had done only training exercises.
Climb should be able to win against this guy, but considering the enemy's coming with poison, it might be a pretty close shave.
Even if Climb had experience in actual combat, Brain couldn't imagine that he had walked a bloody gauntlet that included frequent battles against poisoned weapons.
It might even be his first time.
Even Brain was overly cautious against monsters who use corrosive acids or deadly poisons. It made it hard to fight at his full potential.
Should I kill this guy right away and support Climb? Would that actually be good for him, or would it just mess up his effort to help Sebas? Should I step in and fight for him? No. If it came to that, Sebas would probably save him. If Sebas doesn't seem like he's coming, then should I intervene? I never thought I'd worry about stuff like this.
Brain gave his head a self-conscious scratch with his free hand and stared down his opponent.
Okay. You're gonna make a human sacrifice to make up for lost time.
3 blows. Sebas charged, and before the men could react, much less defend, he'd thrown 3 punches. That was the end of it. Of course it was. Among all of Nosric, Sebas was the most skilled in battle, so he could defeat this level of assassin with his pinky finger. He shifted his eyes from the men crumpling to the ground unconscious, limp like octopuses, and checked on the fight behind him. Brain was keeping constant pressure on his opponent, so he didn't have to worry about him. The assassin fighting him seemed to be searching for an opportunity to run away, but Brain wouldn't let him, like he was toying with him. No, rather than that, it seemed to Sebas like Brain was trying to remove his own rustiness by testing out various attacks.
Come to think of it, I did hear something about making up for lost time. And he must seem a little distracted because he's worried about Climb and wants to be in a position to help him right away if need be. He appears to be a fairly good person.
Sebas turned from Brain to Climb.
Well, he's probably all right.
It was an unstable exchange of offense and defense. He was a little concerned about the poison weapon, but it didn't seem like he needed to jump in and save him immediately. It pained him to involve kind people in his problems, but...
If he hadn't told me he wanted to get stronger, I would save him. Real combat is good training. I'll step in if it comes to that.
Sebas stroked his beard as he watched over Climb's fight. Climb parried a stab with his sword. His back was drenched with cold sweat. A moment too late, and his armor would have been punctured. For a split second, he saw discouragement on his opponent's callous features. Climb thrust with his sword to put some space between them, but his opponent's quick steps back and forth didn't let him. Climb generally fought by blocking with a shield and then attacking with a sword, so just using a sword was a mentally and physically taxing experience. The poison-drenched blade was also a major source of stress. Since a Melbreaker was a stabbing weapon, he knew quite well that he would have to worry about only thrusts. But still, the idea that he couldn't get so much as a scratch made his movements more conservative. He reined in his erratic breathing, a product of his general exhaustion.
He's panting too. I'm not the only one who's tired.
His opponent's forehead was also slick with sweat. He kept Climb at his mercy with his agile, assassin-like fighting. That was why if Climb could injure at least one of his limbs, his advantage would be obliterated, and the balance in their abilities would be disrupted. One blow would decide the battle. That fact was the true nature of the tension between them. Of course, that's how it always was in a clash between equal powers, but it was magnified in this encounter. Shit! With a sharp exhalation, Climb struck. It was a small swing without too much power behind it. He was worried about the potential opening a larger swing would create if its target dodged. The assassin, who easily avoided the swing, put his hand in his breast pocket. Climb, anticipating the assassin's next attack, kept a close eye on that hand. When the dagger shot toward him, Climb batted it away with his sword. He'd been lucky. He'd been able to repel it because he was paying such close attention. But before he could sigh in relief, the assassin launched himself, gliding toward him in a low posture. Crap! A chill went up his spine. He had no way to defend against this follow-up. He'd swung too wildly when he batted away the dagger, perhaps because he was frightened. Since his sword was still in the follow-through, he'd never get it back in time to attack. He wanted to devote all his energy to evading, but the assassin was too quick. He was cornered. At least he could use his arm as a shield. Climb made up his mind when the assassin in front of him suddenly put a hand to his face and leaped aside. A pebble no bigger than a bean had nailed him right above his left eyelid. Climb had been able to see it with his enhanced consciousness in these extreme circumstances. He knew without turning around who had thrown it. That's proof. He heard Sebas's voice.
Fear is an important emotion, but you can't let it constrain you. I've been watching for a while, and you're fighting too monotonously. You're not putting enough into it. If you were really going to sacrifice an arm, you would have died. If you're losing on the physical side, then please win with your spirit. Sometimes the mind surpasses the flesh.
Yes, sir.
Climb answered in his head, and was surprised to find himself feeling calmer. It wasn't the entirely dependent relief of being rescued, but the comfort of having someone watching over him. He couldn't entirely shake the fear that he might be killed. And yet...
If I die, please tell Princess Renair. Tell the princess that I fought bravely.
He let out a long breath and slowly brought his sword back up. Climb sensed a different kind of light in the assassin's eyes. It had been only a short while, but they had come to understand each other as they risked their lives in this battle. His opponent, who sensed Climb's determination, also made his own decision. The assassin charged. It was only natural, but he closed the distance between them in an instant, without a word. Once his opponent had come into range, Climb brought his sword down. That instant, the assassin jumped back. He'd read the speed of Climb's swing and used himself as a lure to pull off a feint. But he'd overlooked one thing. Maybe he'd seen through most of Climb's sword techniques, except one. The one move that Climb had confidence in, his overhead swing, was faster and harder than all his others. The sword came down on the assassin's shoulder, but the male's shirt stopped it from cutting off his arm. However, it easily snapped the man's clavicle, tearing through his flesh and breaking his scapula. The assassin flipped as he fell to the ground. He was in so much pain he was drooling and let out a soundless howl.
Magnificent.
Sebas approached from behind Climb and casually kicked the assassin in the stomach. That was enough for him to go limp, like a doll. He'd probably lost consciousness. In the corner of his eye, Climb could see Brain, who had already defeated his assassin, raising his hands to celebrate for him.
Very well. Now we'll begin questioning them. If you have anything you'd like to ask, please don't hesitate.
Sebas dragged one of them over and jolted him back to consciousness. Then, he put a hand on his forehead. It took less than 2 seconds. He didn't even push very hard, but the man's head bent way back and returned like a pendulum. And with that, the man's eyes had changed. Now they were unfocused, like a drunk's. Sebas began the inquiry. The assassin, who should have known how to keep his mouth shut, blabbed everything. Climb found the scene so strange that he asked,
What did you do to him?
It's a skill called Puppet Palm. I'm glad it worked.
It was a move Climb had never heard of, but he was more concerned about the leaked information itself. He was an assassin trained by one of the Six Arms, the strongest members of the Eight Fingers Security Division, and he had been tailing Sebas in order to kill him. Brain turned to Climb.
I don't know much about the Eight Fingers, but they're a pretty big criminal organization, right? They must have some mercenary connections.
Yes, that's right. And the Six Arms is a name for the strongest members of the group. I remember hearing that each of them is equal to adamantite rank. I don't know who they all are, of course, since it's an underworld matter.
Apparently, Sakirante, who had shown up at the mansion where Sebas served, was one of the Six Arms and had the nickname Illusion Maniac. His plan had been to kill Sebas and take his beautiful master back with him to do with her what he wished. Having heard that much of the man's story, Climb was assailed by chills. The source was Sebas. He stood up slowly, and Brain asked,
What are you going to do, Sebas? Now I know exactly what to do. First, I'll go get rid of the place at the root of all these problems. He said Sakirante is there too. It makes sense to brush away the sparks before there's a fire.
His resolute answer made Climb and Brain catch their breaths. If he was going to raid the place, that meant he was confident he could win against people with adamantite rank ability, the pinnacle of human strength. Of course, it made sense.
He made swift work of those 3 assassins, even though they were so tough, and Sir Unglaus respects him. Who in the world could Sir Sebas be? Maybe a former adamantite adventurer? And he also said there are still others held captive. We should probably act as soon as possible.
Ah, if the assassins don't return, they'll know something is amiss, and we won't be able to save the captives if they relocate them.
Sebas commented. Letting time pass would put him at a disadvantage and give his opponents the upper hand. That was Sebas's predicament.
Okay, my plan is to march in there now. I'm terribly sorry, but I don't intend to change my mind. If you two would please drag these two to a guardhouse.
Please wait, Sebas. If it's all right with you, I'd like to go along and teach these guys a lesson. Only if it's all right with you, of course.
Me too. As one who attends Princess Renair, it's a matter of course for me to keep the peace. If any of this country's people are suffering, I'll rescue them with this sword.
Unglaus may be able to handle it, but I think it might be a bit dangerous for you.
I know it'll be dangerous.
Climb. I think he means you'll be in the way. Well, from Sebas's point of view, we might both be in the way, but...
No, I didn't mean it like that. I'm just worried about you. I don't want you to be misled into believing I would be able to protect you like I did before.
I understand.
You and your master may not get any credit for what we're about to do, you know. There is most likely a more suitable place for you to risk your life.
Averting my eyes from injustice because it's dangerous would make me a worthless man unfit to serve my master. As much as I can, I would like to reach out my hand and aid those who suffered the same way she does. The way she reached out to me.
At Climb's stilly resolution, Sebas and Brain looked at each other.
So, you've made up your mind then?
Climb responded to Sebas with a single nod.
I see. Then I will say no more. Both of you, please lend me your strength.